Okay, I want to start with the laugh scene. If you know nothing about Final Fantasy X, you probably know this scene at least, but do you know the context?
You sound sad.
Yeah, maybe.
Want to scream?
I really don't think that's gonna help this time.
You know what?
Hmm?
It's embarrassing to say this myself, but summoners and their guardians are kind of like Spira's ray of light. A lot of people in Spira depend on us. I learned to practice smiling when I'm feeling sad, you know.
The following is what you know and maybe love and have surely laughed at before. But putting it into the simplest terms, this is a scene where two people are forcing themselves to laugh, forcing themselves to smile, to lighten the blow of the terrible position they're in, the position where they have to deliver hope to everyone in Spira, to protect the world, to risk their lives. But I'm getting ahead of myself. I should have just started with the overview.
Do if I give up my pilgrimage?
Hey! Xanarkin! Let's go to Xanarkin!
I've heard a lot of people refer to Final Fantasy X as the last good Final Fantasy game, and while I don't agree with that assessment, I think it definitely has something that the following games lack. And to be fair, it's something that many of the games before it lack as well. That thing is cohesion. A common joke among people trying to get into Final Fantasy and Final Fantasy fans alike is that the games can be convoluted as sin. Heh. And don't get me wrong, Final Fantasy X is more than guilty of having convoluted moments, but I think that the core themes and characters in the game are so strong that you can effectively ignore them. And all of this is communicated through the game to you. If you look at a game like Final Fantasy VII, sure, you can like and understand the game, but it's worth noting that there are entire games and movies dedicated to filling plot holes and giving backstory. The main reason for that is because of ambition. Final Fantasy VII was, and still is, a very ambitious game. It was the first 3D Final Fantasy game, and Nomura wanted to tell a grand story split across 3 different discs. But it proved a difficult task, and he couldn't fully explore everything he wanted to in one game. Final Fantasy X, on the other hand, balances the ambition with the execution. Yes, it's true that the game has a sequel, but the sequel isn't trying to clear up the questions asked in 10. It's mostly, and almost entirely, its own thing. I'm gonna save this for another video, just trust me on that one. Games like Crisis Core, and to a lesser extent Dirge of Cerberus, serve as means of contextualizing major events in the Final Fantasy VII lore. But I think it's safe to say that Final Fantasy X-2 never would have existed had Final Fantasy X not been a huge success. The events of Crisis Core, however, are something Nomura had in his head from the very beginning. The simplest way I can put it is this. Everything that is necessary to understand and appreciate Final Fantasy X is fully present within the game. Recent Final Fantasy games, like 15, have fallen into old traps, like putting important story into movies and comics, or 13's way of forcing you to sift through data logs to fully understand the story. It's a sloppy way to tell a story, and I hope it's not a trend. But Final Fantasy X is cohesive in more ways than just the physical means that were used to convey the story. This game is a PS2 game, the first Final Fantasy on the PS2 in fact, and one thing that I think it does fairly well is balance its colorful palette and exterior with its dark and depressing themes. The whole game revolves around a few themes: dreams, death, sorrow, oh, and religion. Can't forget religion. Tidus is an outsider. He's unfamiliar with the world of Spira, the customs of its people, and by extension, their beliefs. He asks many questions over the course of the game, which in the beginning just serve as a means of having the story conveyed to us, but it eventually turns into questions that the otherwise devout characters end up asking themselves. The main religion in Spira is the Church of Yevon, and one of the main teachings of Yevon is that you can't use machina, which just means machinery. The reason for that is because Yevon says machina is responsible for the creation of sin, a force of nature essentially considered to be heaven's wrath and judgment on humanity's mistakes. So there's a culture of people called the Al-Bhed that use machina regardless because they don't believe it has anything to do with sin. Conflict ensues in a great scene when Wakka, a very devout follower of Yevon, finds out that another one of your party members, Riku, is an Al-Bhed.
But you Al-Bhed used the forbidden machina. You know what that means? Sin was born because people use machina.
You got proof? Show me proof.
It's in Yevon's teaching. Oh, not that you know.
That's not good enough. Yevon says this, Yevon says that. Can't you think for yourself?
Now, is this scene on the nose? Yeah, it's some quality 2001 cheese, but it was an important message 20 years ago, and it's an important message now.
Come on, Wakka.
What?
I mean, getting angry just because you found out Riku's an Al-Bhed. You guys got along fine till now, didn't you?
That's different. I mean...
And even disregarding the obvious real-world commentary, it's an important moment for Wakka and the rest of the party, sending them down a path of questioning that ultimately leads to the game's final moments. Sin's periodic attacks are responsible for the constant cycle of death that occurs in the game's world, and that's the main reason why Yuna's on her pilgrimage, to stop Sin's reign. Even more on the nose is the name of the world they live in. Spira is indicative of the spiral of death that persists. The game's world and the environments are representative of this theme. You're never just looking at an open field, you're looking at an open field with random mechanical shrapnel spread about. In other words, Final Fantasy X is all about the vibes. The game does a great job of communicating these vibes through the world and music. It's very visually interesting and beautiful to boot. This was, like I said, the first Final Fantasy game on the PS2, and they really tried to utilize the capabilities of the console. It obviously doesn't look the best by today's standards, but it has some real charm to it, between the pre-rendered backgrounds, the low-poly side characters, and the vibrant colors. I think it has some real charm. The game also takes unique inspiration for the setting. Previous Final Fantasies leaned pretty hard into the European fantasy style, but this game takes very heavy inspiration from Eastern and Caribbean culture. You can see it in the way the characters dress and the way Wakka talks.
Dude, our team is gonna rock, eh?
It really helps to make the game have a unique identity from the other Final Fantasies and JRPGs in general, and I think this game was necessary in changing the way Square thought about setting in Final Fantasy going forward. And yeah, they ultimately returned to European-inspired fantasy with games like 15, but without 10, we may have never gotten the Star Wars-inspired Final Fantasy 12 and 13. Then there's the other half of what I just discussed, which is the music. Now, odds are if you showed this scene to a hardcore Final Fantasy X fan, there's a 50-50 chance that they will tear up a little, and largely it is because of the context of the scene, but also just because of the music that goes along with it. The music hits hard. Accompanying the game's unique locales is the amazing soundtrack, co-produced by Nobuo Uematsu and Masashi Hamauzu. Now, Uematsu's reputation goes without saying, But this is a special game because it signifies the passing of the torch. He didn't produce any Final Fantasy soundtracks after this one, leaving work to composers like Hamauzu in 13, Soken in 14, and Shimamura in 15. But you'd never know that this game's soundtrack comes from a transitional period by listening to it, because all of the songs are so fantastic and utilized perfectly within the game. Now, I can't say that this game is Uematsu at his best because, that's dancing mad, but what I can say is that just like everything else in this game, the soundtrack is cohesive and brilliant. We get island instruments in songs like Besaid, Tsutaki Dane covers the Final Fantasy quota of at least one emotional ballad per game. And of course, with one of my personal favorites, Otherworld, the soundtrack can go hard when it needs to. The soundtrack also has a lot of ambient songs like Wandering Flame, courtesy of Hamauzu, and I personally think that these ambient tracks make the soundtrack, but I understand why they could potentially turn off people who prefer more memorable melodies. No matter what you think of it though, Final Fantasy X music is unmistakable and a key part of its identity that adds to the cohesive experience. Before I end the video, I have to hammer home how much of a transitionary period this game was for the franchise. For as many firsts as there were in this game, there's a number of lasts as well. This was the last mainline Final Fantasy game to have a turn-based system. This was the last Final Fantasy game that lets you name your protagonist, a factor that I honestly forgot about. Usually I can notice in RPGs where characters skirt around using my character's name in voice-acted sections, and of course that's present here, but generally the writing in the game is smooth enough for me to not be bothered. And it's things like that that make this game. Transitionary or not, the individual aspects of the game are super refined, coming together to make a wonderful and unique package that can't really be replicated today. Final Fantasy X is a product of its time in the best way possible. Final Fantasy X managed to be one of the most cohesive JRPGs I've ever experienced, not in spite of its transitionary ideas, but because of them. Final Fantasy X is simply what happens when you have a strong vision, and it's a great game because of it.